when somebody brings up, well, what about not asexual? What about intersex people? That's something you hear a lot, and you kind of know that it's like a red herring, but it's hard to sort of like, without knowing the sort of the actual like medicine of it, it's hard to explain it in like a sort of like a bulletproof way. You know what I mean? Because people can always come up with, oh, what about this person who has this weird chromosome? And like, you know, how doesn't that punch a hole in your theory? And so you go at length into this whole question of intersex and how this condition is actually being used to these people are being used as like a for the sake of argument, so to speak, you know, and it's not actually respecting their experience or the reality of their condition as something really distinct from and in some sense irrelevant to the whole transgender question. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is such an important question, because I think the reason that gender identity theory seems so plausible to most people is that the idea of the biological sex binary has been so disrupted. Because without that disruption, I don't think people would find it plausible that being a man or being a woman is really about a subjective sense of self rather than biology. So I do go into a lot of detail about it. It's interesting because I started studying intersex conditions in graduate school when I was doing gender studies. And that was back, 2006, 2007. So I've been aware of this phenomenon for a long time and really interested in it. So it's been fascinating to see it kind of gain this cultural prominence. But basically, so intersex, what is really a canopy term that covers a range of different conditions. So there's not just one intersex condition. There's over a dozen different discrete conditions that affect the normal process of sexual development in some way. A better term is disorders of sexual development or congenital conditions of sexual development. And the best terminology is to use a condition-specific terminology when you're talking about a person, like a man with Klinefelter syndrome or something like that. So intersex definitely does not represent a third sex or some kind of other sex. Intersex conditions should be understood as variations within femaleness and maleness. So atypical pathways of maleness and femaleness. And so that's in general, that's something important to understand. Also, I think it's important to understand that the vast majority of DSDs do not result in sexual ambiguity at birth. So most DSDs happen to unambiguously male or female people. In fact, some people with DSDs don't even find out they have one until they try to have kids. And they're like, oh, or for some women, it's, they suddenly don't menstruate and then they figure out, oh, wow, I actually have an intersex condition. So, but that doesn't mean they're not male or they're not female. And that's the problem of the reasoning, because the reasoning is actually very dehumanizing. It says that, well, people with an intersex condition aren't really male or female. They're something other. So there's something kind of dehumanizing. And also any intersex condition has an objectively physiological diagnosable. It's a diagnosable condition, right? It's objective. Yeah. It's not an identity. Right. You don't identify as intersex. It's a condition that you have, whether you like it or not. And that's another reason why I think it's unhelpful to conflate the trans question with intersex conditions, because they're really very different if you look at the nuances. But it's what's remarkably interesting when you understand and do more research into intersex conditions is how remarkably stable biological sex is. I mean, in 99.98% of all live births, there is no apparent ambiguity at all, right? So, and even in the cases, the 0.02 cases of a more complex DSD, even in those situations, if you have a multidisciplinary team who's, looking at the structure of the person's body as a whole, especially over time and watching how the sexual development process unfolds, then they'll be able to discern which sex is dominating in the person's body, and then that will help them understand how best to support that person in terms of physical care. But that's what the focus should be on, right? It should be on supporting this person's unique individual circumstances and their physiological circumstances specifically, and protecting bodily integrity, because infants with intersex conditions used to be unnecessarily operated on. So there's actually this emphasis on bodily integrity and avoiding unnecessary medicalization in intersex activism, which those are values that are not necessarily shared values when it comes to the transgender activism.
So in those very rare ambiguous cases, is there a like a single sort of ironclad genetic telltale of maleness or femaleness that we can point to?
No. So my argument, and again, I'm not like, I could be wrong about this, but this is what I think about it. My argument is that you have to look at the structure of the whole. So genetics is like, the karyotype is like the recipe. It's kind of what sex should develop. But sometimes, like say, there's an SRY gene on the Y chromosome, and that's usually what, if that gene is activated, then it causes the masculinization of a baby. But it could be that there's a Y chromosome, but the SRY gene fails in some way, and so then the developmental pathway is female. And so the baby develops as a female, even though she's XY chromosome, right? So you have to look at the organization of the structure of the body as a whole, which will be organized either toward the pathway of gestation and femaleness and the production of large gametes, or it will be kind of organized toward the production of small gametes and insemination. And the reason I say that even in very complex situations of complex conditions, one sex predominates rather than the other is that there's never been a documented case of a truly hermaphroditic human being. So a human being capable of producing both sex cells and, fertilizing oneself or whatever. So, even in cases of really complex DSDs, like mosaicism is another interesting one, that there are actually people who have some cells that are XY, some cells that are XX. So you can't just do a DNA test because it comes up like, ambiguous. But then if you actually look at the person, it could be that person with mosaicism has an ovary, and has the potential to be fertile, So that's why I think that you need to look at the structure of the body as whole, which will and sometimes that doesn't happen till adolescence, right? Like sexual development is this really long process. So sometimes you might kind of have to wait and see, what does the body do when puberty starts, right? Because that sometimes will give you more information as well.
You just used the word potential, and that's another fundamental philosophical concept that we're sort of missing to some extent today. In this sort of Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, there's this idea of like potency and actuality, and how does that inform your view of sex?
Yeah, I think that distinction is super important and very helpful, because there's a lot of talk and debate in our culture right now. Like, what is a woman? That's the question of the moment. Right. And, if you say, well, a woman is a human being with a uterus, then someone can say, well, what about a woman who's had a hysterectomy? Is she no longer a woman? Right. So, or a woman who never has a child, right? Is she not a woman? So there are these kind of objections to a biological definition of what it means to be a woman. But I think the distinction between potentiality and actuality solves this problem, right? So I define a woman as the kind of human being who has the potential to gestate life within her. Now, before you object, well, what about a woman who's infertile? Well, that very category, infertility, signals a potential that's being prevented from being actualized, right? Right. You wouldn't say that a biological male who can't get pregnant is infertile, right? And why is that? Right. Because he doesn't have that potential, right? So even the very category of infertility points toward a potential that's innate and that exists, right? Even if it's not actualized. And that distinction solves all the whataboutery when it comes to deciding what means to be female or not. So yeah, a woman is a kind of human being, whose body is organized according to the potential of gestating life.